The relationship ended on a Tuesday evening, not with a dramatic confrontation, not with a single breaking moment, just a conversation that finally said out loud what had been true for a long time. I drove home afterward in a specific silence. Not grief exactly, something more uncomfortable than grief. The absence of surprise. Because I had known, not in the way you know things after they happen and tell yourself you always suspected. Actually known. From month one, the instinct had been there from the beginning. Clear, consistent, pointing in one direction for 2 years. And I had overridden it. Every single time. The relationship ending was not the hard part. The hard part was sitting in my car afterward, understanding that everything it had cost me, I had seen coming from the very beginning. But to understand what that realization actually felt like, you need to know what I had chosen to ignore. I met Sophia at a work event. Not my work, a friend's. One of those industry gatherings where you don't know most of the people in the room and spend the first hour finding the ones worth talking to. She found me before I found her. That should probably have been the first thing I noted. Not as a red flag exactly, just as information about how she moved through rooms. With the specific confidence of someone who had decided what they wanted before they arrived and went directly toward it. She was magnetic. I want to be honest about that because it matters for understanding everything that followed. Not just physically attractive, magnetic in the fuller sense. The kind of presence that makes the room around her feel more alive. That makes you feel more interesting simply by being the person she has decided to talk to. She was funny, sharp in a way that felt like genuine intelligence rather than performance. Asked questions that suggested she was actually listening rather than waiting for her turn. We talked for 2 hours without noticing the time. By the end of the evening, I had given her my number. Something I don't do quickly or easily. The first date was a week later. It was one of the best evenings I could remember having in years. The conversation moved everywhere. Ideas and experiences and opinions offered and received with the ease of two people who have somehow skipped the careful early stage of getting to know someone and arrived directly at something that felt like genuine connection. I drove home afterward feeling the particular lightness of something beginning. That feeling is real, and I don't dismiss it. It was real. The question is not whether what I felt was real. The question is what I did when other things also became real alongside it. The first inconsistency arrived in the 3rd week. Small. A story about where she had been the previous weekend that contained a detail contradicting something she had said earlier in the same conversation. Not dramatically contradicting. The kind of thing you would miss if you weren't paying attention. I was paying attention. I noted it. Felt the specific small discomfort of something not quite fitting. And then I explained it away. Told myself I had misremembered what she said earlier. That the detail I thought I remembered was probably slightly wrong. That I was being overly analytical about something that meant nothing. The explanation was plausible. Plausible enough that I accepted it. And moved on. Looking back, that moment was the template for everything that followed. Not the inconsistency itself. What I did with it. The specific sequence of notice, discomfort, rationalization, and moving on. That sequence would repeat itself many times over the next 2 years. With different details, different situations, different specific things that didn't quite fit, but always the same architecture underneath. Something real being felt, and then being talked out of. By me. About myself. To myself. My friends met her about 6 weeks in. I want to describe their reaction accurately because it is easy in retrospect to overdramatize it. They didn't dislike her openly. Nobody pulled me aside that evening and said something is wrong here. It was subtler than that. The particular quality of a group that is being charming back at someone who is performing charm rather than simply being charming. A certain effort in the room that wasn't usually there. And afterward, the careful phrasing of people who have something to say and are choosing how much of it to say. One friend said she was a lot. Another said she seemed very focused on you. Said it in a tone that made the observation feel like more than a compliment. I received both of those things as positives. Told myself she had made a strong impression, that my friends would warm to her once they knew her better. That first impressions in group settings are not reliable data about a person, all of which was true enough to serve the purpose I needed it to serve, which was allowing me to not examine what they were actually telling me. I had met someone I wanted, and I had begun the work of protecting that wanting from anything that threatened it, including my own perception, including the people who knew me best, including the instinct that had been present since almost the beginning. Quiet, persistent, patient in the way that the truth tends to be patient, willing to wait as long as necessary for the moment you are finally ready to listen. The inconsistencies continued, not at a frequency that felt alarming in any single week, at a frequency that accumulated over months into something I could not have defended if I'd been asked to account for it honestly. Her time was unpredictable in a way that went beyond a busy life. Plans confirmed and then changed at the last moment. Explanations offered that were always just plausible enough to accept. I accepted them. Every time, with the particular generosity of someone who has decided that flexibility is a virtue and that demanding consistency would make him seem controlling. I told myself that story often, that the alternative to accepting her inconsistency was becoming someone who monitored and questioned and demanded accountability. And I didn't want to be that person, which was true, but the story was also doing something else. It was making the only two options controlling or accepting. When there was a third option, I wasn't allowing myself to consider, simply noticing what was in front of me without needing to make it a confrontation. Her phone was always face down around me. I noticed it early, the specific deliberateness of it, not the casual face down of someone who isn't expecting anything, the consistent face down of someone who has made a habit of it. I mentioned it once, lightly. She laughed and said she just found it easier to be present without the screen facing up. Said it with the ease of someone who has answered this question before, or who had prepared for the possibility of being asked it. I accepted the answer, filed the ease with which it arrived somewhere I didn't look at directly, and moved on. The stories about her past had a particular quality, vivid in some areas, strangely vague in others. People she had known well whose names she couldn't quite recall. Places she had lived where the details shifted slightly between tellings. Gaps that appeared in the chronology of her life when I paid attention to the timeline rather than just the content. I paid attention, and then I put the attention away. Told myself that people remember their own lives differently at different times. That the inconsistencies in how she described her past were the natural variation of human memory rather than something more deliberate. The human memory explanation was technically true. It was also the most charitable possible reading of what I was observing. And I had developed a habit of defaulting to the most charitable reading, regardless of what the less charitable reading might have been telling me. My closest friend Daniel said something to me around the 4-month mark. We were having a drink. He said it carefully, in a measured way of someone who has decided the friendship requires honesty, even if the honesty is unwelcome. He said he didn't get a clear sense of her, that every time he had been around her, he came away feeling like he had been in a performance rather than a conversation, that he couldn't explain it more specifically than that. He said he might be completely wrong, that it might just be how she was in groups, but that he wanted to say it because he would rather say it and be wrong than not say it. I thanked him, said I appreciated it, said I understood what he meant, but that she was different one-on-one, more real, more present, that the group dynamic brought something out in her that wasn't her at her best. He nodded, let go, because that is what good friends do when they have said the thing and been heard and the person has made their choice. They let it go, and they stay close enough to be there when the choice produces its consequences. I believe what I told him. That is the part one want to be clear about. I was not consciously lying to Daniel or to myself. I genuinely believed the explanation I was offering, because I had been constructing those explanations for 4 months with enough consistency that they had acquired the texture of truth. The problem with explaining things away repeatedly is that the explanations start to feel like insight. Like you are the person who understands the situation clearly, who sees beyond the surface, who recognizes the complexity that others are missing. When actually you are the person who has become very skilled at not seeing what is directly in front of you, because seeing it would require a decision, and the decision would cost you something you had decided you were not willing to lose. I restructure my life around her at the 6-month mark. Not dramatically, gradually, in the small ways that add up to something significant. Turning down a professional opportunity that would have required more travel. Changing plans I had already made to accommodate hers. Beginning to organize my weeks around her availability rather than my own priorities. Each adjustment individually reasonable. Together, forming a pattern that told me something I wasn't prepared to hear. That I had already committed to something my instincts had been questioning since almost the beginning. The clearest moment came at about 8 months. I want to describe it precisely because it is the moment I return to most often when I think about this honestly. Not the moment the relationship ended. The moment I knew, really knew, and chose to know something else instead. We had been away for a weekend. Nothing significant. A short trip to somewhere neither of us had been. The kind of thing that feels like a test of a relationship without announcing itself as one. How you manage the small frictions of shared space. How you are with each other when the ordinary structures of your separate lives are removed and it is just the two of you in an unfamiliar place. The trip was mostly good. There were moments in it that I genuinely valued. But there was one evening where something shifted. We were at dinner. She received a message. Phone face down as always, but she turned it over briefly. Saw what it was. Her expression changed for just a moment before she managed it back to neutral. A flicker. The specific quality of someone receiving information that requires an internal response they don't want visible. She said it was nothing. Work. Put the phone back face down. Continue the conversation. I watched her continue the conversation. Watched her pick up exactly where we had left off. Fluently. Without any visible seam. And I felt something land in me in that moment that was not uncertainty. It was certainty. The specific, quiet certainty of a person whose instinct has just been confirmed so clearly that the confirmation cannot be immediately rationalized away. I knew what that expression was. Not what the message said. Not who it was from. But what it meant. What it revealed about the space between what I had been given and what was actually true. I sat across the table from her for the rest of that dinner. Talking. Laughing at the right moments. Present on the surface. And underneath the surface, I was doing the thing I had become practiced at doing. Building the explanation. Assembling the reasons why what I had just seen was not what it appeared to be. Why the expression could have meant something else. Why the certainty I had felt was probably anxiety dressed as instinct. Why a person who was as magnetic and as present and as seemingly genuine as she was could not be what the flicker suggested she might be. By the time we left the restaurant, I had constructed something solid enough to stand on. An explanation I could carry through the weekend and beyond. One that allowed the trip to continue without the conversation that the certainty would have required. That conversation would have cost me something. The trip, the relationship, the version of the future I had started to organize my life around. The explanation cost me nothing immediately. It just deferred the invoice, added it to the account. The way deferred costs tend to accumulate interest. I became better at managing the dissonance during that period. That is the honest way to describe it. Not better at seeing things clearly. Better at holding two contradictory things simultaneously. The version of Sophia I wanted to be true, and the version my instincts kept insisting was more accurate. Most of the time, I kept the two things in separate compartments. Operated from the wanted version in my daily life. Allowed the instinct version to exist only as a background frequency I had learned to tune out. I moved cities 4 months later. Not for her explicitly. There was a professional rationale. A genuine one. But the professional rationale had been available for a year, and I had not acted on it. What had changed was that she was in that city, and I had decided that what we had was worth restructuring around. My family thought the timing was interesting. Said it in the careful way families say things when they want to register an observation without starting an argument. I explained the professional rationale thoroughly. They received it without pushing further. And I moved, carrying my instincts with me, still managing them, still explaining them away. In a new city, where the life I had moved to be closer to her was now the primary structure of my existence. Where the cost of finally listening to what I had known since month one had become significantly higher than it had been at the beginning. That is the specific cruelty of deferred costs. The longer you defer them, the more of your life has been built on the foundation you haven't yet been willing to examine, and the more examining it threatens to cost. I had known that. Somewhere. The same place the instinct lived. I just hadn't been willing to look at it directly. Not yet. The second year was different from the first. Not because the flags changed. Because I changed. Not in a good way. In the way a person changes when they have been managing dissonance for long enough that the management starts to affect everything else. I became less certain in general. Not just about her. About my own perception of things. The habit of overriding my instincts had spread in the way habits spread when you practice them consistently. Into other areas, other judgments, other moments where something fell off and I automatically reached for the explanation before fully acknowledging the feeling. I had trained myself to distrust my own reading of situations, and that training did not stay neatly in the compartment I had built for it. The relationship had developed a specific texture by the second year. Not bad exactly, but effortful in a way that the early months had not been. The magnetic quality that had defined the beginning was still present occasionally. In glimpses, enough to remind me of what had drawn me in, enough to keep me oriented toward the hope that the glimpses were the real thing and everything else was a phase we were moving through. But the effort required to maintain ordinary continuity had increased in ways I noticed without fully acknowledging. More careful conversations, more navigation of topics I had learned not to press, more of my own energy going toward managing the dynamic rather than simply being in it. That is a specific kind of exhaustion, the kind that builds slowly because each individual day is manageable, but that accumulates over months into something that changes how you feel when you wake up. Not dread, just the absence of the lightness that should exist in a relationship that is actually right for you. I told Daniel things were complicated. He didn't say I told you so. He asked how I was. I said I was managing. He said managing was not the same as good. I said I knew, and we left it there, because the conversation that would have followed, if I had been honest about everything I was managing, was a conversation I still wasn't ready to have, because having it out loud would have made it too solid to continue explaining away. The financial dimension had become significant by this point, not through any dramatic single expenditure, through the accumulation of 2 years of consistently absorbing more than my share. The move had been expensive. The restructuring of my professional life around the city she was in had cost opportunities one hadn't fully accounted for. The way I had organized my resources around a shared future had produced a present where the sharing was largely directional. I had noticed this for months, had filed it alongside everything else I was not examining directly, had told myself the balance would shift, that the current asymmetry was temporary, part of phase, not a pattern. That story required more maintenance than it used to, because the evidence for it being a phase was not accumulating. And the evidence for it being a pattern was. The clearest escalation happened about 14 months in, a period of about 3 weeks where she was unavailable in a way that went beyond the inconsistency I had normalized, not just difficult to reach, present in a way that felt like deliberate management rather than ordinary busyness. The explanations were still offered, still plausible, but they required more construction than they used to. and the construction was becoming visible. Not to her, to me. I could see myself building the explanations now in a way I hadn't been able to see at the beginning. The rationalization had become conscious in a way it hadn't been when it was still automatic. And conscious rationalization is a different thing from automatic rationalization. It requires you to participate in your own misleading, to actively choose the comfortable version rather than simply defaulting to it. I was actively choosing it, and I knew I was choosing it, which meant I could no longer maintain the story that I simply didn't see the signs. I saw them, all of them, clearly and consistently, and I was choosing to see something else. That shift in self-awareness didn't immediately change my behavior. That is the part that is hardest to account for. Knowing something and acting on the knowing are not the same step. There's a gap between them. And in that gap, I continued, for several more months, choosing the wanting over the knowing. Choosing the version of the future I had restructured my life around over the version my instincts had been describing from the very beginning. Until the evening, it finally became impossible to choose it anymore. The unraveling was not dramatic. I want to be clear about that, because the word unraveling suggests something faster and more visible than what it actually was. It was slow. The way things end when both people have known for a while that they are ending, but neither has yet said it out loud. A gradual withdrawal of energy from the maintenance of something that had been requiring too much maintenance for too long. The conversations became shorter, not because there was nothing to say, because the things worth saying were the things neither of us was willing to say yet. The silences changed quality, from the comfortable silences of two people who don't need to fill every moment to the specific silence of two people who are avoiding the thing that would fill it. I noticed all of it. I was past the stage of not noticing, fully in the stage of seeing clearly and simply watching it unfold. The conversation happened on a Tuesday evening. She came over. We sat in the kitchen the way we had sat in the kitchen hundreds of times. And something in the way she sat down told me, before she said anything, that this was it. Not a confrontation, not a revelation, just the conversation that had been coming for months finally arriving at the moment neither of us could defer it further. She said things weren't working. Said it simply, without the elaborate framing I might have expected from someone who had been so skilled throughout at managing how things were presented. Just that. Things weren't working. I said I knew. She looked at me for a moment. Said she thought I had known for a while. I said yes. And that was largely the honest shape of the conversation. Two people acknowledging what had been true for longer than either of them had been willing to say. There were other things said. The things that get said in these conversations when people are trying to be kind without being dishonest, or honest without being cruel. The particular negotiation of language that endings require. I listened, responded where a response was appropriate, stayed level throughout in the way I had stayed level throughout most of this. Not because I felt nothing, because I had been processing this for long enough that the acute version of the feeling had already been experienced in private on many occasions. This conversation was not the beginning of the end. It was the formalization of something that had already ended in every way that mattered. She left about an hour later. I stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then I picked up my keys. Drove. Not anywhere specific. Just drove. The way you drive, sometimes when you need the motion without the destination. And somewhere in that drive, the thing that needed to be thought about made itself available to be thought about. Not about her. About me. About the 2 years I had just lived. About the specific quality of the cost. Not the financial dimension. Not the professional opportunities declined. Not the city I had moved to. Those were real, but they were not the deepest cost. The deepest cost was what I had done to my own judgment. The systematic practice over 2 years of overriding the most reliable instrument I had. My own perception, my own instinct, my own direct experience of what was in front of me. I had taught myself not to trust it, had practiced that lesson so consistently that the distrust had spread beyond the relationship and into how I moved through everything. And that was not something I could attribute to her. She had not made me do that. I had done it. In the service of wanting something to be true that I had known from a very early stage was not true. The wanting was understandable. The cost of sustaining it was not something I would choose again. I parked somewhere eventually, sat in the car in the specific stillness of someone who has arrived at the end of something and is allowing it to be the end, without rushing to what comes next, without immediately constructing the narrative of recovery, just sitting with what the 2 years had actually been, not the version I had told myself while I was in it, the actual version, which was a person who had all the information he needed for month one, who had chosen not to use it, and who had spent 2 years building a life on a foundation his instincts had been telling him was unstable from the very beginning. That is a specific kind of reckoning, the kind that is not about the other person at all, the kind that is entirely about what you are willing to be honest about with yourself, and what that honesty is going to require of you going forward. The months after the ending were not the hardest months. The hardest months had been the ones inside the relationship, the ones where I was managing the dissonance daily, maintaining 2 contradictory versions of reality simultaneously, spending energy on the maintenance that should have been going somewhere useful. The months after were difficult in a different way, quieter, more honest. The specific difficulty of a person sitting with clear sight after a long period of deliberately limited vision. I moved back eventually, not immediately, but the city I had moved to had been chosen around a relationship that no longer existed. And rebuilding in a place where everything was organized around that choice was not something I wanted to do. The practical unwinding of 2 years of restructured life takes time. It is not one decision. It is a series of smaller ones, each one requiring you to look directly at something you built on a foundation you should have questioned earlier, each one carrying a specific and unglamorous cost. I did the unwinding without drama, just the methodical work of reconstructing something that had been taken apart by my own choices. Daniel was present throughout this period, not in a way that required him to say anything about having said it at month 4. He didn't say it. Neither did I. We just moved forward from where things were, which is what real friendship does. It doesn't require the accounting. It just shows up for the next part. I spent a significant amount of the first few months doing something I had not done properly in 2 years. Listening to myself, not in a dramatic therapeutic sense. Just the ordinary practice of paying attention to my own responses to things. Noticing what felt right and what felt off without immediately moving to explain away the off. Letting the instinct exist long enough to look at it before deciding what to do with it. It sounds simple. It was not simple. 2 years of practiced override had made the automatic move toward rationalization deeply habitual. I caught myself doing it in situations that had nothing to do with relationships, in work decisions, in conversations with people I had just met. The reflexive reach for the comfortable explanation over the accurate one. I caught it, named it, and chose differently. Not every time immediately, but with increasing consistency as the months passed. I thought about what I had actually been doing when I overrode the instinct, trying to understand it precisely. Not to excuse it, to understand it well enough that I didn't simply repeat it in a different context with a different person. What I arrived at was this. The instinct had been telling me something that would have required a decision I wasn't ready to make. And the rationalization was not really about the specific inconsistency or the specific flag in any given moment. It was about avoiding the cost of the decision the flag would have forced. At month 1, that cost would have been a promising beginning abandoned. By month 6, it would have been a relationship I had started to genuinely invest in. By the time I moved cities, the cost was the entire structure of a reconfigured life. The cost had grown with each deferral, and at every stage, I had chosen the lower immediate cost of the explanation over the higher immediate cost of the decision, which is entirely human and entirely understandable. And entirely something I was not going to keep doing. I started working with a therapist about 3 months after the ending. Not because I was struggling in a way that required urgent intervention, because I understood that the pattern I had just lived through was not the first time a version of it had appeared in my life. That the specific combination of strong wanting and systematic instinct override was familiar. That examining where it came from properly was worth doing before it expressed itself again in the next situation. That process was slow and frequently uncomfortable. It required looking at things further back than the 2 years with Sophia, at the history that had made overriding the instinct feel safer than following it, at the early experiences that had taught me to prioritize what I wanted to be true over what I could directly observe. That examination did not produce dramatic revelation. It produced gradual clarity, the specific kind that arrives through patient, honest attention rather than through insight. I began to trust my perception in a way I had not trusted it in a long time. Maybe longer than the 2 years. Maybe longer than I had realized. To act on what I saw rather than what I hoped. To let the instinct be information rather than something to be managed. A year after the ending, I met someone. I want to describe what was different about that experience. Not because it was without uncertainty. Every beginning contains uncertainty. But the quality of the uncertainty was different. The first time something fell off, I didn't reach for the explanation. I sat with it, looked at it directly, asked what it was telling me. It turned out to be minor. Something genuinely explainable by ordinary human complexity rather than by anything more significant. But I had looked at it, really looked, rather than managing it into something I could live with. That distinction changed the entire texture of the experience. Being in something I had genuinely assessed rather than something I had constructed around a wanting. The relationship that developed from that beginning is not a story I'm going to tell here. It is still happening. And things that are still happening deserve their own time before they become something you can look back on clearly. What I can say is that I am in it differently than I was in the 2 years with Sophia. Present in a way that requires less management. More honest about what I observe, and more willing to say what I observe rather than filing it somewhere quiet. The instinct is part of the process now rather than something running separately from it. That is the change. Not that I found someone better. That I became someone more capable of seeing what was actually in front of me and acting on what I saw. I think about the version of myself at month 1 with Sophia sometimes, standing at a work event, feeling the first small thing that didn't quite sit right, and reaching automatically for the explanation. I understand that version of myself clearly. He was not stupid. He was not weak. He was someone who wanted something and was not yet ready to let what he knew interfere with what he wanted. I have some compassion for him. And I have learned to be someone different from him, not someone who assumes the worst, not someone who treats every instinct as a warning and every flag as a reason to leave. Just someone who looks at what is actually in front of him, who lets the instinct be information, who understands that the cost of listening to yourself early is always lower than the cost of not listening to yourself for 2 years. Always, without exception. Even when the thing you have to give up at the beginning is something you wanted very badly. The wanting does not change what the knowing already knows.